Thank you. I think I wanted to pick up where Jenny left off on the question of coming to binding agreements. And you said somehow that it's trust that gets people to the bargaining table. I think it's actually power, and we need to look for power. Where is power? And I think just this kind of global supply chain thinking of power, there's a shift in trade union power where a lot of the agreements coming to the table now is actually pushed from the consumer side, not from the producer sides and the workers themselves. So that's just a note on that. And that's also leads me to the reflection I had in the break with my former boss, that when we had African unions coming to Norway talking about how did we end up in this society where we are now with all these kind of trust, also including in the work life and industrial relations, most of them were extremely interested in looking into history where we did not come from a place of trust. We came from a place of industrial relations that were extremely conflictual and ended up in an agreement, and that was based on power. And I think that has kind of lacked from the discussions early on today on where we are today and where that comes from. And that's my kind of entry point to being interested in African unions and what kind of power the African unions have in building institutions and types of trust. And I've been working specifically on Nigeria and oil unions. But I just want to say a few words on how does this back? That African unions are seen generally as weak, but they're also often feared, partly because they are powerful. One of the reasons they are powerful is that even though they're very small and have been more affected by globalization in the sense of liberalization of work systems than possibly any other continent, they do control the most important part of the economy. And whereas we often think of the textile sector, manufacturing, that has moved to Asia, that also moved away from Africa. So the basis in some of the strongest trade unions in Africa is at the end of the supply chain, producing raw materials in the mining and oil sectors. And you can see in the strongest trade unions in Africa, they're often based in mining, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and oil in Nigeria. And that is kind of an entry point. And this Swedish researcher is based his research in Nigeria and say that even though the unions are very, very small size-wise, in Nigeria we talk about 4 to 5 million organized workers in a country of almost 200 million people. And they do still play a significant role in fighting for democracy, anti-corruption, universal rights, citizenship, and issues that we've been talking about all day today about building trust in society. However, these sectors are also some of the most vulnerable to liberalization. That came first with the oil crisis in the 70s and the structural adjustment programs in the 80s. And it has been particularly targeted at these sectors. So just before I go to Nigeria and the Niger Delta in specific, there was a wave of protests in sub-Saharan Africa that very few people talked about, that was parallel to the Arab Spring. One of the reasons why it was not talked about was they were not about regime change in the same way as the Arab Spring was. But you could still see that in the countries with strong trade unions, the protests were more effective. We also saw that in the Arab Spring with the Tunisians, where the unions did play a particular role. This is from Marikana, just an illustration of how the kind of end of the global supply chain is the power base of change and innovation also in the trade unions. And this is from the Marikana mine workers. There's a lot of controversies and difficulties in it. But there's something new happening in South Africa around that. In Nigeria, we saw the biggest mobilization in the country's history, maybe apart from the early 90s. Both times, the oil worker unions were absolutely key. Millions of people were in the street, but it was only when the oil workers threatened to shut down production that government called for negotiations. Secondly, that they actually did call for negotiation is first that matter of the power of the strike, the power of the unions to actually shut down or potentially shut down the flow of the economy. In Nigeria, 70% of the government's income is from the oil. Potentially, if 35,000 organized workers lay down their tools, the country stops. And the income to the corrupt elites stops. So, however, there was also a lot of criticism on that oil unions for not actually shutting down and for not taking the social responsibility that they were expected to, that they did historically, especially in the 1990s, where ICM, one of your former unions, had an international campaign on the oil unions that were imprisoned for playing the central role in democracy movement in the 90s. So what I was interested in was going down to the Niger Delta to understand more the dynamics and power base of the actual unions, considering the globalization process of liberalization, reorganization of work life, and that it's also an extremely conflictual and tense society building on all kinds of controversies and conflicts around oil and international oil companies. So it kind of comes back to the global. So, I'm sorry. If we go down to the Niger Delta, you can say you've gotten an extremely segmented form of labor force as a result of liberalization or casualization, as they would say in Nigeria, which is a kind of a process describing moving from core permanent jobs with good labor conditions into precarious work. If we look back into the 80s and 90s, there was actually a growing tendency to have a trust system even in the international and multinational companies, where unionists said that the companies rolled out the carpet to have social dialogue system, build union-based labor regime, meaning systems where it was actually the unions that were expected to be part of setting the conditions for labor and workers at the workplace. Since then, the liberalization of reorganization of the workforce has escalated even further. So if we should categorize what happens of today in the labor force, I have to say numbers in Nigeria are extremely untrustworthy. But if we should use the numbers that we have and assume that they're more or less okay, we can say that there's about 60,000 oil workers, which is extremely low in that huge country, but still that important. There are estimates that 20 to 30% are expatriate workers. I don't think there's any Norwegians. There's a lot of Scottish. So if you go to Port Harcourt, there's a lot of tattooed Scots. They are not organized in Nigeria. They set their working conditions at home. That's something I would like to hear if Industrial ever discussed and talked about how to kind of work together, because as of now, there's no discussions between those kind of unions and between foreign workers and local workers. And this is not something I did research on, but I would love to do. There's also a lot of rumors that this also hinders the strike because they often control the most central production site. So even if the Nigerian workers go on strike, the foreigners will keep things going. And this is also tensions that we see in Ghana. And there's also a class division, which is also reflected in the union structure. There's senior workers and junior workers. So there has been a process where there's a tendency to casualize junior workers. And if some of the junior workers are kept in the company, they may be promoted to avoid two kinds of unions, not least because the junior workers are a bit more militant in their strategies. So, and this is described by the unions as a clear divide and rule tactics of the companies. But generally, the unionists say that the multinational companies are better when it comes to agreements, to have a social dialogue process, to actually implement agreements, and they have better working conditions. So one of the big contentious spots here has been local content. So the last 10 years, there's also been a nationalization process where especially the supply industry and production, what's it called? Is nationalized and given to not necessarily the production side, but the downstream side of the industry is given to Nigerian employers. This has been very important to the unions. Now it's backfiring because these workers or employers do hire more on patronage-based, clientelist, family-wise, and resist organization more than the multinational companies even. So in addition to this fragmentation of the workforce where casual workers, contract workers are very, very, very difficult to organize, and mainly on junior workers' side, you have this new national Nigerian work or employers that are more difficult to work with. And then you have third category, in addition to the subcontractors and contractor industry and labor broker industry, there's part of the CSR politics, that there's been a lot of pressure on both from communities, because a lot of the workers that are permanent and senior are not from the Niger Delta. They come from other parts of the country. So there's very little work or employment opportunities for local communities. So in CSR agreements between companies and community leaders, they also provide for employment. And some of these employment rules are extremely weird. You have chiefs now being labor brokers and in principle employers, which they completely avoid. And the workers also think of the multinational companies as the actual employers because they may do surveillance and security work of the pipelines. So if the chief don't give them their salary, who do they then complain to? Normally they end up complaining to Shell or the back company and not the chief, partly because the chief is often a dangerous person to be unfriendly with. And you also have in these communities available labor force that is just available when needed. They have often also been used against workers on strike to hinder the strike. So what a manager told me was that whoever has the upper hand, depending on if the unionist is from the local community, speak the local language, they may have the upper hand and get the support from community youth. Otherwise, it may be the managers who have that control. Just quickly reflecting on this industry being extremely global and by nature transnational, there is still very little transnational solidarity within the oil sector. It's growing and there's a lot of initiatives coming up, but there's no real cooperation within companies. And I know the Norwegians are also taking this up within the industrial, how to build intra-company solidarity and power. So I think there's a lot of potential in building that kind of transnational power, but it's still in the early stages. I think I have 10 seconds left, so I don't want to do the details on that.
Thank you.